The first drops of sweat began to bead on Jake Martinez's forehead as he surveyed his meticulously maintained backyard. The California sun beat down mercilessly, transforming his pristine in-ground pool into a shimmering oasis that seemed to mock the suffocating heat. He had worked 3 jobs and saved for nearly a decade to build this slice of paradise, a private sanctuary that represented every sacrifice he and his wife, Maria, had ever made. But paradise, Jake was about to learn, came with a price, and that price had a name: Linda Hawthorne. The Hawthorne residence sat directly behind Jake's property, separated by a carefully maintained wooden fence that Linda had been eyeing with increasing contempt over the past few weeks. She was the quintessential homeowners association nightmare. A middle-aged woman with too much time, too little empathy, and an outsized sense of entitlement that seemed to grow exponentially with each passing summer. Jake first noticed her persistent staring during the previous weekend's family barbecue. While his nieces and nephews splashed and laughed in the pool, Linda had stood at her upstairs window, binoculars pressed against her eyes, her expression a mixture of rage and calculation. It was the kind of look that suggested she was planning something far more sinister than a friendly neighborhood complaint. Maria had noticed it too. "She's going to be trouble," she had whispered to Jake, her hand squeezing his arm. "I can feel it." Jake was a pragmatic man. At 42, he'd seen his share of neighborhood disputes during his years working as a construction project manager. He believed in communication and solving problems before they escalated. So when the first official HOA letter arrived, neatly typed with Linda's signature prominently displayed at the bottom, he didn't immediately panic. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. It cited some obscure clause about community recreational spaces and equitable access, suggesting that Jake's private pool could and should be made available to other homeowners during specific hours. The subtext was clear. Linda wanted access to his pool, and she was willing to weaponize every possible HOA regulation to get it. What Linda didn't know was that Jake wasn't just any homeowner. He understood rules, bureaucracy, and most importantly, he knew how to fight back. Each line of her letter was carefully constructed, but Jake could see the legal Swiss cheese, full of holes and wishful thinking. Little did Jake realize that Linda was about to escalate things in a way no one could have predicted. Her husband, Tom, a local police officer with a reputation for taking his wife's side in every conceivable dispute, was about to enter the equation. And when he did, the quiet suburban street would never be the same. As Jake folded the HOA letter and placed it on his kitchen counter, he had no idea that the summer was about to become a battleground, and that Linda Hawthorne was preparing her first, most aggressive attack. The knock came precisely at 7:45 on a Tuesday evening. Jake was grilling dinner, the smoky aroma of carne asada filling the backyard, when he heard the authoritative rap against the front door. Maria exchanged a knowing glance with him. This was no ordinary neighborhood visit. Tom Hawthorne stood ramrod straight, his police uniform pressed to perfection, a sheaf of papers clutched in his right hand. The overhead porch light cast harsh shadows across his square-jawed face, making him look more like an enforcer than a neighborhood police officer. "Mr. Martinez," he began, his voice a practiced blend of official tone and barely concealed aggression, "I'm here regarding a community compliance matter." Jake wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, his construction worker muscles tensing almost imperceptibly. He'd dealt with plenty of tough guys before, on job sites, in project meetings, during neighborhood disputes. This was just another challenge. "Officer Hawthorne," Jake responded evenly, "I assume this is about the HOA letter." Tom's lips tightened. He wasn't used to homeowners who didn't immediately cower. "The homeowners association bylaws are clear. Recreational facilities that can benefit the community should be accessible. Your pool is private property," Jake interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Purchased with my own money, built on my own property, maintained at my own expense." The tension crackled like electricity between them. Tom took a half step forward, using his height and police uniform as an implied threat. "The bylaws have no provision for mandatory pool sharing," Jake finished for him. He'd studied those bylaws more thoroughly than Linda could have imagined. Each word was a calculated chess move. Maria appeared beside Jake, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a gesture of support, but also a subtle restraint. She knew of her husband's temper, how quickly calm could transform into confrontation. Tom's eyes narrowed. This wasn't going according to his wife's script. Linda had been certain her husband's badge would intimidate Jake into submission, but Jake Martinez wasn't someone who intimidated easily. "This isn't over," Tom finally said, his voice low. "The HOA takes these matters seriously." Jake's response was a measured smile. "I look forward to their official communication, not intimidation tactics." As Tom turned to leave, the streetlight caught the side of his police cruiser. Jake noticed something. A hastily hidden camera mounted near the dashboard, pointed directly at his property. The first seeds of a larger conflict were being planted. What Tom and Linda didn't know was that Jake had been preparing for this moment long before they realized a battle was brewing, and he was 3 moves ahead of their current strategy. A suburban night settled around them, thick with unspoken threats and the promise of a conflict that was only just beginning. The HOA hearing room felt like a battlefield disguised as a community center conference room. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the rows of folding chairs and the long table where the HOA board members sat like a tribunal of suburban bureaucrats. Jake Martinez arrived precisely on time, a meticulously organized binder tucked under his arm. Maria sat behind him, her steady presence a silent source of strength. Across the room, Linda Hawthorne whispered furiously to her husband Tom, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Board President Richard Simmons, a retired accountant with wire-rimmed glasses and a paunch that suggested years of sedentary living, cleared his throat. "Mr. Martinez, the board has reviewed your property's non-compliance with community recreation guidelines." Jake's response was immediate and calculated. "With all due respect, there are no guidelines that mandate private pool sharing. I've reviewed every single page of the HOA bylaws, and I can demonstrate why." What followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic defense. Jake methodically dismantled each of Linda's claims, producing documents, citing specific bylaw sections, and presenting a legal argument so airtight that even Tom, the police officer who thought he could intimidate Jake, looked impressed. Linda's face transformed. The initial confidence melted into a stark realization that her plan was unraveling. Her husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding her increasingly desperate glances. Furthermore, Jake continued, pulling out a series of photographs. "I can prove that my pool installation exceeded all community standards. I'd obtained every necessary permit, paid all required fees, and maintained perfect compliance with local building codes." Richard Simmons leafed through the documents, his expression changing from stern to grudgingly respectful. Linda had miscalculated badly. She had expected a simple takedown, a quick victory that would force Jake to open his pool to the neighborhood. Instead, she was watching her carefully constructed plan crumble. But Jake wasn't finished. He knew this was about more than just a pool. This was about respect, about boundaries, about a homeowner's right to privacy. A suggestion that private property should be communally accessed without compensation, without consent, is not just legally incorrect, it's fundamentally inappropriate, Jake stated, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Tom Hawthorne knew his wife well enough to recognize the brewing storm in her eyes. Linda was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully. As the board members began to discuss the matter, whispering among themselves, Jake could see the wheels turning in her mind. This battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz, a monotonous soundtrack to a suburban conflict that was about to escalate in ways no one could predict. The next week brought an unexpected twist to Jake and Maria's ongoing battle with the Hawthorns. It started with a knock at the door, but this time it wasn't Tom in his police uniform or Linda with another complaint. Instead, a silver-haired woman named Eleanor Rodriguez stood on their doorstep, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of mischief and determination. "I heard about what you're going through," Eleanor announced without preamble, "and I'm here to help." Eleanor, it turned out, was a retired civil rights attorney who had spent decades fighting bureaucratic overreach. She had been a silent observer at the HOA hearing, taking mental notes while Jake dismantled Linda's arguments. Now she was offering her expertise pro bono. "These HOA boards," Eleanor explained over coffee in Jake and Maria's kitchen, "they're like small dictatorships. They prey on homeowners who don't know their rights." She spread out a series of documents, revealing a pattern of similar harassment cases in neighboring communities. Maria listened intently, her initial nervousness giving way to a growing sense of empowerment. Jake appreciated Eleanor's strategic approach. She wasn't just offering sympathy, she was providing a roadmap of legal resistance. Meanwhile, Linda was not taking her defeat quietly. Jake discovered additional surveillance cameras had been installed on the Hawthorne's property, clearly aimed at monitoring his pool and backyard. It was a clear escalation, one that would have intimidated most homeowners. But Jake was different. With Eleanor's guidance, he began documenting everything. Every camera angle, every suspicious interaction, every attempt at intimidation went into a meticulously organized file. Tom's position as a police officer, which he had used as a weapon, was about to become his greatest liability. The neighborhood began to take notice. Other homeowners, tired of Linda's constant complaints and power plays, started reaching out to Jake. What had begun as a private dispute was becoming a community statement about individual rights and neighborhood respect. "She's been doing this for years," whispered Mike Thompson, a neighbor who dropped by one evening. "Terrorizing people with HOA rules, using her husband's position to intimidate. Nobody stood up to her before." Eleanor's involvement changed the entire dynamic. She helped Jake draft a comprehensive response to the HOA, highlighting not just the legal inconsistencies in their demands, but also potential violations of privacy laws by the Hawthorns. Tom began to look increasingly uncomfortable. His wife's vendetta was drawing unwanted attention, threatening the carefully constructed image of respectability he had maintained as a local police officer. As the summer heat intensified, so did the brewing conflict. Jake and Maria knew that Linda would not accept defeat easily. The pool, that shimmering backyard oasis, had become more than just a body of water. It was now a symbol of resistance, of personal freedom against petty bureaucratic tyranny. The next move was coming, and nobody, least of all the Hawthorns, knew exactly what it would be. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. Jake's phone erupted with an urgency that instantly jolted him and Maria awake. It was the local police dispatch, but not Tom Hawthorne's usual unit. "Mr. Martinez," the dispatcher's voice was professional but tinged with an underlying tension, "we need you to come down to the station. There's been a complaint filed against you." Maria's hand gripped Jake's arm. They both knew this was Linda and Tom's next move. At the police station, Jake discovered the complaint was as bizarre as it was calculated. Linda had filed a formal report claiming Jake was running an illegal business operation from his backyard. The accusation suggested he was charging neighborhood children for pool access, a complete fabrication designed to trigger an investigation and potentially force him to shut down his pool. But Linda had made a critical error. Jake's meticulously kept records, thanks to Eleanor's guidance, told a different story. His smartphone was loaded with timestamps, video evidence, and documentation that systematically dismantled every single one of Linda's claims. The investigating detective, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Rodriguez, no relation to Eleanor, listened carefully as Jake presented his evidence. Her expression grew increasingly skeptical of Linda's accusations. "Mr. Hawthorne's wife has filed multiple complaints," the detective said slowly, reviewing the paperwork. "This seems like a pattern of harassment more than a legitimate legal concern." What Linda didn't anticipate was the cumulative effect of her actions. Jake had been quietly gathering support from other neighborhood residents who had similarly been targeted by her aggressive HOA tactics. Witnesses were now willing to come forward, sharing their own experiences with the Hawthorns' intimidation. Tom's position as a police officer was becoming a liability. The department was beginning to take notice of how he and his wife were misusing official channels to pursue a personal vendetta. Internal Affairs would later review the multiple frivolous reports filed against Jake. Meanwhile, Eleanor was preparing the next phase of their defense. She had uncovered evidence of previous complaints filed by Linda that had been summarily dismissed, a pattern of behavior that suggested a systematic attempt to weaponize bureaucratic systems for personal vendettas. The pool, that shimmering symbol of summer leisure, had become the epicenter of a much larger battle. It was no longer just about a backyard swimming pool. It was about community integrity, personal rights, and the abuse of power. As Jake left the police station that morning, he knew the final confrontation was approaching. Linda and Tom had played their most desperate card, and they had failed. But Jake also understood that desperate people often become most dangerous when cornered. The suburban battlefield was about to witness its final explosive battle. The final hearing was unlike any the neighborhood had ever seen. The community center meeting room was packed, standing room only, with residents who had come to witness the resolution of a conflict that had become legendary in their suburban enclave. Tom Hawthorne sat rigidly beside his wife, their once confident demeanor now replaced by a palpable sense of defeat. The HOA board, led by Richard Simmons, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Eleanor Rodriguez sat next to Jake and Maria, her experienced eyes scanning the room with the precision of a seasoned legal strategist. What unfolded was more than just a resolution to a pool dispute. It was a comprehensive accounting of the Hawthorns' systematic harassment. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple investigations had revealed Tom's misuse of police resources to pursue a personal vendetta. Linda's repeated false complaints had not only wasted municipal time but had violated several HOA and community guidelines. The tide of public opinion had turned completely against them. "Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne," Richard Simmons began, his voice trembling slightly, "the board finds multiple violations on your part. These include harassment, misuse of official resources, and repeated filing of false complaints." The consequences were swift and decisive. Tom faced a comprehensive internal affairs investigation that would likely end his career in law enforcement. Linda was removed from all HOA committee positions, a position she had used as a weapon for years. Their attempts to control and intimidate their neighbors had backfired spectacularly. Jake, surprisingly, took no pleasure in their downfall. During a break in the proceedings, he turned to Maria and Eleanor. "This was never about winning," he said quietly. "This was about standing up for what's right." The neighborhood had transformed through this conflict. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves now spoke to one another, united by their shared experience of resisting bullying and bureaucratic overreach. Eleanor Rodriguez became an informal legal advisor, helping other residents understand their rights. As for the pool, Jake's original point of contention, it remained precisely what it had always been: a private sanctuary, a testament to his hard work and personal freedom. In the parking lot after the hearing, Mike Thompson, one of the neighbors who had initially been too afraid to speak up, approached Jake. "You changed things around here," he said, extending his hand. "Not just for yourself, but for all of us." Jake simply smiled. The real victory wasn't in defeating Linda and Tom. It was in showing that ordinary people could stand up to intimidation, that community could triumph over individual malice. As summer began to fade and the pool's waters caught the golden light of early evening, Jake knew something fundamental had changed. Not just in his backyard, but in the entire neighborhood. Some battles are won not through aggression, but through patience, documentation, and an unwavering commitment to principle.